So as we've been developing our Angular 1 application here, you might have been wondering to yourself, I wonder if I should just wait until Angular 2 comes out. I wonder if this is all just kind of a waste of time to learn Angular 1, and if really Angular 2 is the next hot thing. And in a lot of ways, Angular 2 is the next hot thing, and there's a lot of people using Angular 2 already. But the fact of the matter is that Angular 2 is still under development, and it's really not ready or recommended for production applications yet. Aside from that, Angular 2 is really a huge leap from Angular 1. There are very, very few things in Angular 2 that look the same as Angular 1, so it's really a different beast. And if you're brand new to Angular at all, and especially if you're kind of newer to web development in general, then it's really not a bad thing that we've learned Angular 1 in this course. Angular 1 is also going to still be around for quite a long time after Angular 2 gets out of beta and is ready for use. So like I mentioned, Angular 2 is really quite different from Angular 1, and this kind of raises the question of why. Why is it so different, and why are we moving away from Angular 1 when we've just seen that it works quite well to build applications? There's actually quite a few reasons for this, but let's take a look at some of the more common ones. So to begin with, Angular 1 is actually quite tricky to get good performance out of. So as applications get really data intense and they need to perform really fast and be able to repaint the screen very quickly, Angular 1, if not used properly, can really create some drawbacks on performance. In other words, it can be a little bit slow. Now, chances are if you're building a modest application, you won't really notice this, but when you start to get thousands and thousands of elements on a page, then it really does start to show its slowness. Now, there are ways to have Angular 1 perform well in these scenarios, but the truth is that it just doesn't come out of the box for us. Another problem as applications get larger is that it really becomes difficult in Angular 1 to manage state and data. So like we just saw in our ng classifieds app, we were passing data between controllers with events. So we would emit some data and then listen for it somewhere else with the $on method. And this works, but if we start to do that all over our application in many, many different locations, eventually it gets really tricky to see and have a good picture of what's going on and how data is making its way from one controller to the next. This same sort of problem shows up with two-way data binding. So two-way data binding is an awesome feature. We can bind an input to some text elements, and then we get automatic updates between the two of them. But this is something that can get really tricky to reason about, again, as applications become larger. And lastly, Angular 1 really isn't built to take advantage of evolving web standards and new features of the web. So we've got things like web components now that Angular 1 just really doesn't take into consideration. So those are some drawbacks of Angular 1. Now, what do we know about Angular 2 and how it's different? Well, the big thing to start off with is that it is component-based. So pretty much everything in an Angular 2 application is going to be a component. And what's really cool about this is it's a very, very simplified approach to making applications. And by making reusable components in our application, we've got a lot of options for just plugging them in wherever we need them. Another big thing, and this is really huge, is that Angular 2 is written in TypeScript. So TypeScript is a language developed by Microsoft that is basically JavaScript with type annotations. So what does that mean exactly? Well, if we think about JavaScript, JavaScript doesn't have any way to enforce types. It doesn't let the developer define what kind of type a variable is or an argument should be. And so, for example, we could have some function that takes an argument, and as we develop that function, we might know that it's supposed to take, say, a string or a number, but the problem is when somebody else goes to use that function, they could pass in an argument of a totally different type that we weren't expecting. And so the way around this, of course, is often in functions, we'll check for the type that is passed in. But TypeScript is really cool because it lets us define what type of variable or an argument should be. And then when we go to use, say, a function that takes an argument of a certain type, there are ways for us as developers to know what type of argument that function expects. And finally, probably the one that I like the most is that Angular 2 is simplified. It is far simpler than Angular 1. Now, there's still quite a bit of a learning curve to it, but it's simplified in that there are no longer many ways to do a certain thing. So if we think about Angular 1, there are about 4 ways to create a service. We've got services and factories and constants and providers. But in Angular 2, it really just boils down to being components and directives. That's all we have in Angular 2. So this lets us have a much simpler mental model of the framework, and it lets us be more effective as developers. Now, one of the big questions about Angular 2 revolves around whether or not it's ready yet. And at the time of this recording, Angular 2 is in Beta 2. So it recently came out of Alpha, and then it hit Beta 0, Beta 1, and now Beta 2. So this means that the API for Angular 2, the way that we use it, is starting to stabilize. It's pretty well stable. There are still going to be changes, of course, and some of them might be breaking changes. In fact, we should expect there to be breaking changes, but it is more stable now than it was when it was in Alpha. Now, the official recommendation is still that Angular 1 be used for production applications, and that people wait until Angular 2 comes out of beta before using it for production. So there's a bit on Angular 2. Now, what are we going to cover in this module? Well, we're going to take part of our ng-classifieds application and convert it to Angular 2. We're not going to redo the whole application because that would be another course unto itself, but we're just going to get a feel for how Angular 2 works by taking a small part of it and converting it. Now, the Angular material library, which you might have come to really like, is unfortunately not ready for Angular 2 just yet. There is work taking place to convert it to Angular 2, but it isn't available at the time of this recording. So because of that, we're going to use Bootstrap. And so maybe you're familiar with Bootstrap already. We're just going to use some simple CSS classes from Bootstrap and keep things really light and really simple. And finally, we're going to get a feel for TypeScript in this course. Now, Angular 2 is, of course, written in TypeScript, and you can use TypeScript to write your Angular 2 applications, and that's actually the recommended approach. Most of the tutorials and the code samples out there are written in TypeScript, but you're not constrained to that. You can still use plain old ES5 JavaScript or plain ES 2015 JavaScript too. All right, so let's get started converting a part of our ng-classifieds app to Angular 2.